Good morning. My name is Robin DiPietro, and I am a program coordinator for OneOp. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session, The Science of Learning for Neurodiverse Children. In case you're joining us for the first time, I'd like to give a brief tour of our webinar platform so you can find your way around. Hopefully, you are currently able to view the slides we're sharing. If you're unable to see them or have any other difficulties, please send us an email at contact@oneop.org for assistance. And I will put that in the chat right now for you all in case you need that. As some of you've already done, we look forward to having you join us in the chat pod for conversation and questions. To embed the chat pod so you don't miss any links or conversation, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You'll then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of the screen, and from there, just click the chat bubble icon. When typing questions or comments, please be sure to select everyone from the response options drop-down menu so everyone is able to view them in the chat pod. Note that the slides and resources are available for download on the event page for today's session. We'll be covering continuing education information at the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned at the end if you're interested in continuing education credits or a certificate of attendance. Thank you for joining us as we continue our partnership with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to expand the readiness, knowledge, and networks of the professionals supporting our military service members and their families. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the Defense Department, U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. government, or OneOp. The mention of any entity or product is for informational purposes only. Today we have with us again Dr. Celeste Austin. Celeste has dedicated her life to autism because of her autistic sister, Amanda. After earning an MD PhD from the University of Texas Health Science Center in San Antonio, Dr. Austin knew she wanted to help more autistic children and founded GoManda, named after her sister Amanda. Inspired by the unique learning style of Amanda and other autistic individuals, GoManda is dedicated to celebrating the unique mind of autism. GoManda has created a platform that teaches vocabulary using strength-based teaching, a teaching method that works with autism's unique learning style rather than against it. Dr. Austin is also a professor at the University of Texas in Austin. Before I turn things over to Dr. Austin, you may want to make sure you have a copy of the slides that they can be found on the webinar event page under event materials. A link to that page will be placed in the chat momentarily. At this time, I'm going to mute my microphone and turn things over to Dr. Austin.
Hi, thank you so much. It is such an honor to be back. I really, really enjoyed our last webinar, and if you haven't had a chance, please check it out where we go over the basics of neurodiversity. Today, I wanted to explore even deeper about the neuroscience and the science of learning for neurodivergent and neurodiverse individuals. So today, we're going to explore some of the neurological findings that we've seen in neurodiverse individuals. We're going to compare neurotypical and neurodivergent learning styles, and then hopefully, through this knowledge, construct some sort of individualized support based on that knowledge of the neuroscience of different learning styles. So before we start, I would love to know how many of you guys have seen the previous webinar. It just gives us an idea of where we're starting. And it's okay if you haven't, please check it out. And so just go ahead, there should be a poll, whether you've watched it live, you've watched it on demand, or you have not watched it. And I'll give you guys, while I'm talking, you can go ahead and answer. Okay, so just as a recap as to what is neurodiversity, this is something that we did touch a little bit on the last webinar, but I'm just going to do a little recap just to make sure we're all on the same page. To remind you, the neurodiversity model states that neurodiversity is the idea that different wirings do exist. And then this is actually to many a scientific fact, because I think we can all acknowledge that there are different neurological wirings that exist in any population. The neurodiversity paradigm extends that idea and says that not only do we have these neurological wirings at different neurological wirings that do exist, but they are considered normal and natural variants in society. In fact, disorders are considered differences. And the neurodiversity movement that we talked about in the previous webinar, is the movement that seeks civil rights, equality, respect, and full societal inclusion for neurodivergent individuals. Now, a lot of questions about where the neurodiversity term originated. You'll see a lot of literature out there and a lot of maybe posts about Judy Singer being the one who coined the term. But it is now coming out that perhaps that term came out of autistic web forums in the 90s and it was kind of borrowed by Judy Singer. Now, we will talk a lot about autism, and especially and when we're talking about neurodiversity, because it's very strongly associated with the autism social movement and strongly associated with autism acceptance. So the heart of the concept of neurodiversity is the idea that there are these neurological differences, but there are a pool of individuals called neurotypical population that kind of represent the majority of the population. Neurodivergent population or neurominorities are those who are outside of that population. They represent a very unique neurological wiring, and we give labels to those like autism, ADHD, and so forth. So, for example, we have an umbrella of conditions under neurodiversity. These only represent here the common childhood conditions that we typically serve. For example, if you're a speech pathologist or even a psychiatrist, these are probably the conditions that you see commonly in childhood. But keep in mind that neurodiversity is a wide range of conditions. Now, I focus a lot about autism on this talk only because that is where my expertise is. But keep in mind that when we're talking about all of these concepts, that we can apply these to other conditions like dyslexia, ADHD, and so forth. So what is autism? Just to make sure we're all on the same page, the DSM-5 has a very strict criteria in which social communication interaction differences and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior have to be seen to receive that diagnosis. And there's also criteria under these. What I like to talk about is that what our definition of autism is constantly changing. So if we look at where we were many, many years ago in a DSM-1 and where we are now a DSM-5, we can see how much is shaping our definition of autism. And it's constantly being shaped by research and even by the lived experience of those who are autistic. I kind of left some of these blank here if you notice attentional differences, perceptual differences, only because I have a thought process that maybe this at some point will be appreciated in a definition of autism. And as you notice here, sensory differences I kind of shaded in a different way, only because now we're realizing how much of a role sensory differences has on autism. Again, we're shaping our definition of autism. And so when we're thinking about autism, a lot of people will use terminology like less autistic, more autistic, severe, less severe. And it's a very simplistic way of looking at autism. Rather, what we're realizing that there's all these collection of cognitive abilities that shape autism, and that it's better for us to support our students, our children, when we look at it from this lens, when we're looking at all the different cognitive abilities that are contributing to autism. And that way, if there's a student, for example, or a child who is needing more support in a language, we can give that appropriate and more individualized support rather than on the left side using very broad labels like less or more or severe or less severe. And I've mentioned this in our last talk about how we can help with that understanding of autism and neurodiversity. Lightening the load was a concept that I introduced, where we see behaviors that on the outside may look like perhaps a tantrum, but in fact, they're communicating to us the needs that are unmet on that child. And so part of our job as practitioners, as parents, as caregivers, is to help lighten that load. And it all starts with the mindset. And that was kind of the focus of the first talk. How do we put on a neurodiversity lens? How do we understand double empathy? How do we use the appropriate language? How do we stay curious about our child? that is something that should be extended to both the ecosystem of the child, which include the family and the care team. And then today I want to take that concept, we're going to build on top of that mindset and talk a little bit about supporting that child's environment. And I strongly believe that part of that support is to understand the neuroscience. Because if we can understand the neuroscience of that child and where they're at, we can better provide individualized support. And so during what we're going to talk about in terms of support, we're going to talk about the physical environment and the learning style and what uh, encompasses both of those realms. Once those big mindset and supporting the child's environment are met, we can finally help that child thrive. Now, this was a kind of my particular lightening the load was my concept of taking a collection of the learned experience of my own, seeing my sister grow up, and then listening to the lived experience of autistic individuals and then looking at the data out there and the science out there. Now, you might see that it might borrow a little bit from what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a psychology model of kind of what all of us kind of need to reach what's called self-actualization. And so you'll see that I borrowed a little bit of that from this model. And I kind of added on the bottom here is that if I was to take Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I would put on the very bottom the mindset of the child's ecosystem. I strongly believe that that is kind of the fertile ground to help a child, especially a neurodivergent child, reach self-actualization. So let's explore the neuroscience of the neurodivergent brain. And remember, I'm going to talk a lot about autism, but you can kind of take those ideas and stretch them to other neurodivergent conditions. I think the only way that we can really appreciate this is by understanding the human brain development. So here you're going to see a timeline. And of course, you can see the birth sitting over here. And before that, we have the fetal and embryonic period. Now, keep in mind, before birth, those are illustrated in weeks. After birth, they're illustrated in months. And as you can see during the embryonic and fetal uh, period, we have a lot of neurogenesis, meaning a lot of neuronal growth. A lot of migration, meaning these neurons are going to the places that they need to be. And then differentiation and maturation stretches beyond birth, meaning these are times when the neurons mature to their appropriate role. There's something interesting that happens after birth, and that's what's called pruning. In fact, when there's all this neurogenesis, all of this maturation of neurons, the last stage of human brain development is after birth in many parts of the brain, and it involves actually cutting back the neurons, cutting back the connections. It's kind of like a fine tuning. So, for example, I have a next slide here that kind of shows kind of the events. So, synapse formation are the connections that are made between neurons. And you can see that about a year, we can see a lot of synapse formation, kind of peaking around 6 months to 1 year. After that, we can see in 2 years and 6 years, a lot of pruning that's happening. So it's a lot of fine tuning. Perhaps I don't need this many synapse formation for this particular task. And this happens in a lot of parts of the brain. And so for autistic people, what we see is that there's sensory processing differences, attentional differences, and detailed focus perceptual preferences. So how does that translate to what we see in the neuroscience field? And keep in mind, up to 95% autistic children have sensory differences. A lot of people have actually wondered whether or not we should redefine autism as mostly a sensory difference. And so that's up to debate. I'm not going to go into that, but that's something to think about. And so keep in mind when we're talking about sensory, of course we remember the basic senses, right? Like our hearing, smelling, tasting, visual, tactile, but there's also three other ones to consider. Proprioception, which is kind of the sense of movement of your body. Interoception is kind of understanding or having a sense of what's going on inside of your body, even emotions. And vestibular, which is balance. And so one of the theories out there is one of the hypotheses is the neurosensitivity hypothesis. And there's always a debate about nature versus nurture, and I'm sure you've heard some sort of debate about this. But what kind of the prevailing theory is that there's an interplay between both. So someone's environment and someone's genes play together to create whatever the mature version of your, for example, in some parts of the brain, whatever that maturation looks like is an interplay between your environment and your genes. And that is more, especially so for your neurosensitivity hypothesis. If you have sensitivity genes and you're exposed to a certain type of environment, and that's environment is also meaning the sensory stimuli in that environment, that can shape your sensitivity of your central nervous system. As you can imagine, when you have now a built sensitivity, you can have responses to that sensitivity, and that shapes our psychology, our behavior, and even our physiology. So let's take that and talk a little bit about the brain and how can we put all these concepts together. So here's kind of a cross-section of the brain, and I'm going to point out the cerebellum. Now, I know that we've learned about the cerebellum probably in some point of our life, and we kind of correlate the cerebellum with our motor movement. But it turns out that cerebellum has actually one other critical role, and that is the filtering of the outside information, the sensory information on the outside, to the brain. And it's something that people overlook a lot. So in this case, we're going to talk about the cerebellum in that way. It's considered the filter. Once that information is filtered, that information goes to the thalamus, which processes that sensory information. And then that information is taken to our cerebral cortex, which is the implementer, which decides what to do with that information. So if I kind of just do a sequential overlay here, we can see that if we had some sensory information from the outside world, it's being filtered through our cerebellum, then are processed by our thalamus, and then overall our brain, our cerebral cortex will process and implement whatever the response will be for that. And so we can overlay that to this paradigm where we have our sensitivity and our central nervous system defined by our filter of our cerebellum, our thalamus, the processor, and then our response determined by our cerebral cortex. In fact, we can see all this information by all these imaging studies that have been done to show that there's increased connectivity in the cerebellum and thalamus in autistic individuals. So going back to the idea of pruning and synapse formation, we think that for autistic individuals, their differences in sensory processing is rooted on increased neuronal connectivity in their cerebellum and thalamus. And that goes back to what's called the Dunn's model of sensory processing. Taking what we know of this sensitivity, we can actually build a matrix of this sort, which kind of talks about how there's some individuals with high neurological thresholds, meaning they can take on a lot of sensory stimuli. And then there are those who can have a low neurological threshold, and they can take on a less of a sensory stimuli input. So low neurological threshold would be considered hypersensitive. High neurological threshold would be considered hyposensitive. And if you notice, there's another range illustrated here, which is passive and active. So whether that person has self-regulation tools that are passive versus active, that's where they're going to lie. So now this is an opportunity for us to put all this together. How can we put all this neuroscience that we just learned to how neurodivergent children learn? The first thing to note is that there is a significant discrepancy between the intellectual ability and the broad academic performance of autistic individuals. So, for example, 60% of autistic students perform way below their predicted achievement level based on an overall intellectual ability in at least one subject domain. What does that tell us? It tells us that we're doing something wrong to help serve autistic students. And a lot of that is rooted upon the sensory environment of a student, especially in the classroom. Now, there's also can be sensory stimuli at home, But a lot of the data that we see is coming from the environments that we can measure, which is in the classroom. And we notice that some classrooms, the sensory stimuli can affect attention because of the increased distraction in the environment. So let's take a look at this. This is a typical classroom. And we're gonna go over why these areas are highlighted. But this is kind of a typical classroom where there is a teacher kind of showing a book of some sort and a lot of students circled around, interacting, engaging, and so forth. But what's not also noted is, and probably has become white noise for many of us, is kind of the stuff that's around the classroom, for example, on the walls. Now, this one paper kind of illustrated all of the sensory and attentional demands in a typical classroom. So for example, here in red, if there was a student right here sitting in kind of in the middle of, in the bottom of this frame, you can understand that there could be tactile stimuli by being touched by other peers. Maybe not intentionally, but just even if they're raising their hand, they might be bumping into the student. There's also visual sensory demands, right, all around in terms of these posters, these colorful posters, and so forth. Auditory, if this is a very engaging classroom, a lot of peers can be talking, shouting, perhaps. Those are all auditory stimuli. And of course, the teacher is obviously wanting everyone to pay attention to this book and what she's talking about. And you can imagine that that is requiring some sort of attentional demand, despite all these other areas kind of distracting. And so when we're thinking about sensory and attentional demands, and we're thinking about a typical classroom, we can imagine how, for a student who may have a high or low neurological demand for sensitivity and sensory stimuli, this can be actually extremely difficult. If you are hypersensitive, you're going to have a hard time juggling out all of these different sensory stimuli in order to pay attention to what the teacher wants. This is our first kind of role of helping supporting students who are neurodivergent, is that we need to address the sensory stimuli in their environment, in their ecosystem. The other is that the less kind of visual sensory demands, because here we can kind of point out all of the different attentional demands. But what about when they're learning? What about if we're giving them perhaps something as basic as learning a leaf, for example? Does the sensory demands, does the sensory stimuli, does those sensory differences, do they make a difference? And they do. That's what we've realized. So for example, if I was teaching a child leaf, for example, with this kind of picture, we're going to map out kind of the journey between an autistic and neurotypical child, learning the new word leaf. So I've shown this leaf to both students. Keep in mind that both have different sensory processing, whether it's the filter or the processor or the implementer, whatever it is, there are differences between these two children. For a neurotypical child, they actually have a really good filter. Their cerebellum is very good at filtering out sensory information. Whereas an autistic child, typically they have a less strict filter. Their filter is a little different than a neurotypical. As a result, a neurotypical child might look at this leaf and say, well, I think that the color of the leaf, the texture of the leaf are not relevant. My filter has kind of filtered out these information because they are not important. But what is important is the shape of the leaf. The autistic child will be going and looking at the same leaf, but however, their filter will say, actually, the color, the texture is important and alongside the shape. So as you can see, who has more sensory information coming in? It's going to be the autistic child, because all the information of the leaf is important, whereas a neurotypical child, only the shape is important. As a result, when they're labeling or mind mapping the concept of leaf, an autistic child will say, everything about this leaf makes it a leaf. The color, the texture, the shape. Whereas a neurotypical child, their mind map is, it's just the shape that makes this leaf. Now, how does this pose an issue? If I was to show, and by the way, these preferences that an autistic child has is called detailed focus perceptual preference. What that basically means is that all the information, like the color, the texture, is all called relevant information. Whereas in a neurotypical child, that's considered irrelevant. And you can imagine that these create attentional differences, right? So an autistic child is paying attention to more things than a neurotypical child. So how does that pose a problem when we introduce a new type of leaf? Well, using they both have the same previously different filters, right? So a neurotypical child has more of a filter, autistic child less of a filter. When both of them are processing this, let's take a look at the neurotypical child. Again, the color and the texture are irrelevant, while the shape is relevant. Based on that framework that they have created in their head, they can appropriately label this as leaf because it matches the shape that they've created in the mind map in their head. Now, the autistic child, it's a little bit different because the color and the texture and the shape of the leaf makes it a leaf. They are thinking, hey, this is not the same as that green item that I had earlier that had kind of a smooth texture and was shaped like this. In fact, this is completely different. So this, I don't know what this new item is. And you can see how this poses a problem when it comes to tying in the ideas around your environment, comprehension, right? Comprehension of the world around you because of these very strict rules of what is relevant and what's not. When everything is relevant, you create very, very small categories of items. Whereas if you have a very less stringent filter, you actually create very broad categories, right? And so this can be posing a problem when we're learning our vocabulary, which is kind of the foundation of communication. Another way we can say this is that autistic people use what's called bottom-up processing. They really use the information from their senses. And of course, because they are hypersensitive, most are, they kind of have a lot of information to work with, to assemble and work upwards to create an idea or a perception. Whereas top-down processing is what typically what we will see in neurotypical individuals in which they use mental models, ideas, previous experiences to interpret what they see. So basically, in bottom-up processing, what am I seeing based on the information brought to me? Whereas top-down, is this something I've seen before? Is there a mental model that I have inside of me that I can match this with? And we can see that this correlates with also the parts of our brain. So for example, in bottom up, we're moving from our cerebellum all the way up to our prefrontal cortex, or this is the same thing as our cerebral cortex. So we're moving from our filter all the way up to our cerebral cortex. Whereas top down, we're going the other way. We're going from our cerebral cortex to our cerebellum in a way. So we're going from what our mental models are up here in our cerebral cortex, and then taking that to interpret our sensory experience. So these are completely two different ways of processing. And you can imagine if we're teaching with the top-down processing with someone who has a bottom-up processing, this can pose a challenge, right? So how do we help a student who has bottom-up processing, who has a detailed focused perception like an autistic child? How do we help them? We help them create those mental models by showing them all the different types of leaves. So basically, instead of just showing them one type of leaf, show them all the variations that can exist in their environment. And sometimes that can be challenging because there's probably leaves that you don't even consider presenting. But that's okay, as long as we can start showing enough leaves, for example, to kind of form a very detailed mental model. And in fact, what makes this kind of amazing for autistic individuals is that they create a mental model that's much, much more detailed than a neurotypical person. They might be noticing patterns that maybe we don't even see, right, as a neurotypical person. And so that's kind of what is amazing about this, and why we shouldn't really be teaching against it, but teaching with it. Let's work on giving all the examples so that they can create a very detailed mental model. So, for example, if we show enough information, enough variations of leaves, perhaps they can still process and have filtered the and see that the color and the texture and the shape are things that they're filtering in, right? Because they don't have much, they have a very less stringent filter than a neurotypical. But based on the mental models that they've collected over time, they can eventually say, you know what, I think it's the shape that we need to care about most for this leaf, so they can appropriately assign the label leaf for that. And it's no wonder that this is an issue because 70%, we're not teaching the right way because 70% of autistic students really struggle with this vocabulary comprehension. And I focus on this because this has been kind of the foundation for that connection to the environment that autistic people struggle with because they're not getting the appropriate kind of appropriate, you know, learning strategies. And so vocabulary comprehension can be the foundation to a lack of communication, which can lead to a lack of literacy or decreased literacy. And this can actually kind of have a more downstream effect later on in adulthood, not only for advocacy of themselves, but also health literacy. And there's a lot of data that suggests that because autistic individuals do not have that kind of communication, not only are they having sensory issues with their proprioception and interoception, but they perhaps don't even have the right language based on the lack of vocabulary comprehension to appropriately communicate um, some of the symptoms that they might have. And in fact, there's a lot of data to suggest that autistic individuals actually they have a lifespan of about 40 to 50 because they are ignoring their symptoms and concerns, or they're not communicating those symptoms and concerns. So this has a very downstream effect. Not only that, a lack of vocabulary comprehension can lead what others might see as challenging behaviors. These behaviors are internalizing or externalizing, but they can be a root of not feeling connected to their environment, to the people around them, feeling isolated, which can lead to mental health issues, and perhaps they are externalizing that as aggression. I'm going to take a pause here for any questions. Um, we're going to talk a little bit about the supports for sensory differences. And if you want, you can actually post kind of what your solutions have been as we move forward. But this will be an opportunity if there's any questions.
So while people are putting stuff in the chat, perhaps I did have one come in that said, this information on the sensitivity of individuals who are neurodivergent is so interesting. I often encounter parents who want an explanation for why their child is the way they are. What do you say to them without making them feel guilty about environments?
I tell them, and that's a great question. A lot of times parents feel guilty, something, did I do something? And absolutely not. It's one of the things I like to talk about is the strengths of sensitivity. It's amazing to be able to collect so much data in your environment. In a world where we talk about data a lot, um, data is great. Now, is it exhausting to collect that much data as a child? Absolutely. And that's where being a parent and caregiver comes in. So framing it in that way, saying your child is collecting a lot of data of their sensory environment, and it can be an overload. How can you help support them and kind of lighten that load? So, you know, maybe if we're trying to learn vocabulary, let's say, because we just talked about it, maybe we can help lighten that load by giving them a sensory environment that's a little less distracting. Maybe not a room with a bunch of windows or maybe a bunch of stuff on the walls. How can I lighten the load in that way? Or maybe put them in a room that's a little bit more quiet so they can focus on their lesson. Um, to me, I think our role is to support and help that child thrive. And there's nothing wrong that they're collecting all this data. It's just our role to give them the tools for them to take that and to thrive. And one of the things is people kind of demonize sensitivity, I feel like. And again, I just think that that seems very short-sighted because there are a lot of careers that for example, autistic individuals thrive in because of all the details that are involved in it. For example, programming involves a lot of details. You have to have that kind of brain to be able to take in so much information and to see all the details and the patterns that maybe a neurotypical person doesn't see and to process that. And so there isn't a world for, and I think it's even more increasingly as we are becoming a more modern world for people who are able to process and to collect so much data in their head in terms of sensory stimuli. So I think it's just about framing it as how can you lighten the load? How can we kind of help lighten the things that might be too distracting to help that child thrive? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move forward, um, kind of in the same thread of how we can support. So we talked a little bit about lightening that load. We talked about mindset in the first seminar. Now we're talking about the child's environment. And part of that was kind of understanding that sensitivity from a neurological point of view. So what can we do? And we kind of hinted the physical environment. What can we do to help our children who have sensory differences that are especially seen in neurodivergent children? So we talked a little bit about the sensory needs. So how do we do that? You can probably start thinking about that classroom, right? How we can probably maybe remove some of the visual stimuli, maybe help with the auditory stimuli, and so forth. We can kind of start to kind of think because if we understand the thresholds, the sensitivities, we can actually kind of form an individualized plan. And just to remind you of all the different senses, even though it's easy for us to kind of talk about visual and tactile and even auditory, keep in mind there's other senses that we need to consider as well. There's a really great infograph made by Your Kids Table. It's an occupational therapist on Instagram. Now, this person isn't neurodivergent from what I know. However, they have such great visuals about understanding the different hypersensitive and hyposensitive um, sensory profiles. So they break it down to visual, tactile, auditory, and all the other senses that we've already talked about. What does the seeking mean and what does the avoiding mean? So basically, these are individuals, if you're avoiding, you're probably more hypersensitive. If you're seeking, you're more hyposensitive. And so I'm not going to go through these because I think you guys are going to be taking these slides, but take a look at this. These are really, really great. She does a really good job of kind of explaining and going through each of these. And it kind of gives you an idea if you don't want to do a formal assessment, maybe you can kind of suggest or guess what your child might have. So these are really great, and we'll not dwell on these, but what we'll dwell on is kind of more of the supports that we can give. So if you have a student who has visual hypersensitivity, one of the things that we can do in their environment is to kind of decrease the fluorescent lighting. So fluorescent lighting can be extremely distracting. You can give sunglasses to kind of nullify that, but if you can find a way to decrease it, that'd be awesome. You can even do blackout curtains if that works for if you have a very, very busy like window where the visual outside is extremely distracting, like a busy street or something like that. You can find workstations with walls to kind of hide those visual distractions. So keep in mind, if we have a person who's taking in so much data of their environment, any additional data that's not pertinent to the task in hand can be extremely distracting and more data that probably is not necessary for that task. So when we can lighten the load by reducing some of these stimuli, that can be extremely helpful. And extremely helpful for a child who doesn't have the tools yet to advocate for themselves. If they're hyposensitive, they're going to be seeking out visual stimuli. And so you can create spaces in which you can kind of create visual stimulation, little visual stimulation breaks with kind of bright reflective lights. There's all kinds of creative ways that you can do this, you can imagine. You can even create very vibrant visual instructions, and this can be very helpful to even give instructions, right? So you can actually kind of give them that visual seeking part of themselves by giving them instructions. So you can kind of knock two things at once. If they're tactile hypersensitive, a lot of times we forget that the texture of food can be, especially if they're using their hands, You can change the texture of the food. Um, Always kind of make sure that if you have a child who's hypersensitive to tactile, make sure their ecosystem understands to ask before any physical contact. That's really important to create a safe environment. And you've probably seen some Instagram videos or TikTok videos of teachers who are providing alternative greetings like high five or just saying hi. You don't even know hugs if you don't want any hugs. This is excellent because it's really honoring the sensitivity profile of that child. And then another one is clothing, making sure there's no seams, no tags, things like that. And if they're hyposensitive, you might have heard of weighted blankets. Those can be very helpful. Things that are very stimulating in terms of the touch of it. So all kinds of things, jellies, Play-Doh. You can even for chewing, give them latex-free, straws. There can be physical tasks, right, that you can give that really are about that tactile stimulation. So like pulling a wagon can even be good. Taste. If they're hypersensitive, they may favor bland food. If they're hypo, they may want the opposite. But always make sure that there is dietary variety, of course, because we don't want to always give them the same kind of food. We're also caring about their health as well. So make sure that you can find a creative way to incorporate fiber and so forth. For the smell, olfactory, hypersensitive, unscented detergents, perfumes. I don't know about you guys, but I actually have a little bit of a hypersensitivity for smell. And these kind of things like perfumes can actually make me feel nauseous. So I totally relate on this end. Unscented shampoo and soaps, absolutely for me as well. I've actually had bought a soap for our guest bathroom, and it actually made me so nauseous I threw it out. It was terrible. So, for this, promoting a fragrance-free environment can be extremely helpful too, if you can. And in hyposensitive, perhaps create a hygiene schedule. Um, and making sure because someone who's hyposensitive might actually love being around strong smelling scents, might even try to get themselves into situations that are extremely messy because of the smell of it. So make sure that you're very cognizant of that and create a hygiene schedule to address that. Auditory for hypersensitive, you might have heard of ear defenders. Those are really extremely helpful. Making sure that doors and windows are shut during lessons are extremely helpful. Making sure that outside noise doesn't come in. And for hyposensitive, using kind of more verbal and auditory breaks that are very stimulating. So, for example, you can give music breaks for people who are hyposensitive, toys that make a lot of sound, like drums. And make sure when you're doing all these supports, you let other people, because there's always going to be a variety, a diversity of sensory profiles in any environment. Let others know that this is going to be happening, or perhaps find an environment that's a little bit more mindful of other people's sensory profiles. Proprioception is this idea that we sensing our movement. So hypersensitive might need actually more of high fine motor activities. Whereas a hyposensitive, big activities like weighted blankets, positioning furniture, things like that, those are tend to be more of a good way to support someone who's hyposensitive in proprioception. You can use tape to define boundaries. As you can expect, these activities can be very, very big activities. So make sure that you kind of define, say, hey, this area is where you can go, you can move furniture, you can do all kinds of things, but not outside the area to honor other individuals with different sensory profiles. Vestibular is balance. Make sure for hypersensitive individuals, break down events or activities into small steps, use visual cues. These individuals are hypersensitive to their balance, so they'll need a lot of help. And so one way you can help is to break down everything into smaller steps. Whereas those who are hyposensitive, they're going to gravitate towards things like a swing, a trampoline, things that can really um, be extremely challenging or present that stimulation to their vestibular system. If you're wondering how you can assess, there's this great site called Affect Autism, where you can actually download a sensory screening tool. Um, and these are kind of going along with that Instagram post. You can see that there's a lot of similarities here to kind of help you, but this might give you kind of a framework. This is not a formal assessment. This is just kind of a framework to work off of. The last thing that we can do is we can support stimming to self-regulate the sensory stimuli in the environment. So stimming, if you don't know what stimming is any kind of repetitive activity or repetitive self-regulatory activity that a student or a child or even adult may do to help self-regulate. So you might think of flapping your arms. You may think of even vocal things that a vocal stem that someone might do. There's all kinds of ways that someone can stem, and this is all in a goal to self-regulate. So what do I mean? So there's a lot of neuroscience to suggest that when a child, especially those who are autistic, when they're needing to stem, they might be receiving stimuli that's overwhelming. And because at this point in their life, their neurological threshold is a certain way that this is overstimulating, they might need to self-regulate in some way, and they found a solution, and that's called stemming. Stemming, whether it's flapping your arms or whatever activity that is needed, actually increases beta endorphins, which are kind of our happy hormone. And it actually also increases dopamine production, which is kind of a reward hormone. So both of these are increased with stemming for autistic and other sensory different child. You can see how there's different types of stemming that correlate with the sensory system. For example, vocal, auditory, tactile. And we're not going to go through these, but this is a great reference of the types of stemming that can actually be very helpful for autistic or other children who have sensory differences. There's been studies done. Autistic adults report that stemming is a coping mechanism to reduce anxiety, reduce overstimulation, and a way to calm down. This is their self-soothing mechanism. And for someone who has a lot of sensory information coming in, this is sometimes their little anchor, a sensory anchor in a way to cope with a very overwhelming environment. So, for example, if we take our environment and there's a sensory overload along with maybe our thoughts about it, it can create an uncontainable emotion. And one way that we can help self-soothe when we reach this point is stemming. So we talked a little bit about mindset before, but now we're talking about supporting the child's environment. We've talked about the physical environment. We've talked a little bit about embracing a learning style. And we talked a little bit about the science of learning of neurodiversity and strength-based approach. When we take into consideration all of this, and when we do all these mindset and supporting the child's environment, we can help the child's needs be met. And therefore, they can thrive and reach a point of self-advocacy where they can now have the tools to be independent and have a good well-being. There's this incredible study that was done where scientists kind of collaborated with other neurodivergent individuals to create 5 ways to support neurodiversity in any environment. And I thought this is such a great paper, and I wanted to share it with you. And these are basically, in a way, a plea to the world of ways to help support neurodivergent individuals. And one of the ways, one of the heart of it was to give students the freedom to rise to expectations, which I think is something to think about when we don't wear a neurodiversity lens. We might have lower expectations. And so giving the students a freedom to rise to expectations not only says that there are expectations, we know that they can do it, but we give them the freedom of how they want to do it. So first is obviously mindset, which we've talked about. There's a lot of anecdotal comments in this paper that says that a lot of these individuals said that they could sense that their environment, for example, the people like their parents or even their teachers, saw them in a negative way, and they could feel that. Even though they couldn't communicate it, they could feel it. And so it's really important to examine ourselves and say, do we have that mindset? Because a child can sense it. Number two, presume competence even when you don't hear or see it. And that kind of goes back to even number one, right? A lot of the comments made in this paper is feeling like there were very low expectations and that there were ways that that teacher or maybe even the parent through nonverbal language was communicating how they perceived them. And they knew it, they could see it, they could feel it. Um, and so even if they couldn't communicate it, they could feel it. And when we presume competence, we actually increase success for that student. We increase trust. And so there's many accounts in this paper about that one teacher, that one person in their life who actually believed in them. And that was when they thrived the most. See the whole child and their strengths. A lot of times we are very focused on what's considered deficits. Of course, if you went to seminar one, you understand now that that word is very subjective. But seeing the whole child and their strengths is extremely important. One of the things about seeing them for their strengths is that you're actually curious. You're curious about that child. You're curious about their past, their preferences, how they spend their time, what gives them joy, and you kind of utilize that, right? If you know one thing that they're interested in, you can tap into that and use that as a source of learning opportunities and even a source of a way to kind of socialize with that individual. We talked a lot about this, providing a sensory-friendly environment. This was another key way that a lot of neurodivergent individuals say to really support them is to make sure that you're looking at all the different sensory stimuli that could be existing in that environment. And we've talked about this, so I don't really want to go into it, but for example, right, the visual stimuli and so forth. And then the last thing that they say, they plea is wait. Always allow some downtime to contemplate words or plan a response. So I know that we live in a very fast-paced environment, especially in a classroom, where we demand a response. But for a lot of students who have sensory differences, they're processing all of this sensory information in their head. And so their response is going to take a little bit longer. And so if there was that grace given to them in class, perhaps they would have come up with an answer that would have stunned you. And there was a teacher that we talked with who said, you know, I decided that I had these time constraints on these quizzes in class, and I had a student that consistently would make a very low grade. And so I decided one day I'm going to expand the time a little bit and give that student an opportunity to, because they were not responding. They could not finish the test or quiz. And when they gave them that time, lo and behold, they made a high scoring grade because they were given enough time. And so it's just we have a very fast paced and demanding class and demanding, I guess, world. And it would be nice if that opportunity was given to have someone be able to have the time to process and to give a response that is their own, right? With enough time. This is an opportunity to have any more questions. I think that is kind of the gist of this talk. I really appreciated talking and kind of sharing these ideas with you guys, but I would love to hear if you guys have any questions or even suggestions of things that you've tried in the past.
So there's one question in the chat, and then I have some others that have come in. Steph asks, I have students that are both hypo and hyper depending on the time of day or environment. Is this typical for children with autism?
So depending on this, you're saying depending on the sensory stimuli, they can be hyper or hypo. So
I
that's
think
yeah,
I
is
think
that
what
right?
they're saying is sometimes it depends on the time of day even or the environment. So that could be um, the type of context, but the time of day. So maybe they're more hypo in the morning or not less in the afternoon, or, it's kind of how I read that. But Steph, if
So
you've got more to add, throw it in the chat, please.
my interpretation of that just off the bat is that there's something that happens in the morning, let's say, that's different from what the afternoon is. And perhaps it's a certain stimuli that we're not seeing. So that's where the curiosity comes in. And so that could be it's not as black and white as, okay, all visual stimuli. There can be variety within that realm that can be more hyper and hyposensitive. So the key is let's try to figure out what that is. What what stimuli, what visual stimuli, let's say, is what's hypersensitive, what visual stimuli is hyposensitive. There can be variations. And you can even imagine when we're talking about neuroscience and things like that, there can be parts of the brain that could have different pruning, different synapse formation, more so than others, for example. And so that's where we're going to see that variation, right? I always say like biology and neuroscience can get a little messy because we like to, as humans, we like to put everything in nice little boxes. Even this talk, right? I'm trying to put everything in nice little neat boxes. But in reality, it can get a little messy and there can be variations and variety. That's kind of where that term, when you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So um, the challenge I would present to you is kind of figure out what's different um, in the different times of the days and see if you can, as a detective in a way, figure out what is its particular that's changed for morning versus afternoon, let's say. And maybe that can be a clue as to what's going on.
Okay, thanks. There was another one that another individual asked, how does nature and the outdoors affect the learning of children with autism and other neurodiverse kids?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So it just depends on what their neurological threshold is. So if you're going to do anything outdoors, again, you need to be understanding and pretty much know the sensory profile of that child before introducing them to an environment like that. Um, if you're going to have, so I actually hosted a nature walk. And so one of the things you have to be aware of is kind of if you know the sensory profile of each, that'd be great. If you know who has visual sensitivities, you can be more careful, making sure that you're sitting close with them or walking close to them because they might get distracted. They might be overwhelming with all the stimuli. Now, nature actually tends to be extremely calming. And so there's not as much stimuli as, let's say, we go to a Times Square. So that's where an advantage comes in. But it doesn't mean that for some individuals, it still is stimulating. If you have a very sensory seeking individuals, you might also want to keep careful because they might be wanting to touch everything, perhaps, if they're tactile hyposensitive. So just when you understand the profile of the people that you're working with, right, you can appropriately support. But nature walk, I will say, tends to be the least stimulus environment or stimuli environment compared to I guess like I always say Times Square, but like something like that. So you're at a nice advantage. At the same time, it's kind of a little bit dangerous because there's things that are poisonous and things like that. So just knowing the sensory profile can help guide how you're going to do it.
Great, thank you. We've got a few more here. As an administrator, how might I begin to get my school-based staff to think differently, excuse me, about neurodivergent students? Is there a practical resource or two that you might recommend that I might have them read to use to then facilitate an opening conversation?
Oh, that's a great question. So one of the things that you can do is kind of introduce the concept of sensory differences. And the great resources out there, really, there's so many out there. So I don't want to like completely, black out all the other amazing content out there. But if you want, there's the Affect Autism that has that sensory profile assessment that you can do. Um, Again, I have that great resource of that Instagram occupational therapist who makes such great content of explaining hypersensitive and hyposensitive. But one of the things that you want to kind of ask your educators is, do you have a space in your classroom dedicated for those who have sensory differences? Meaning, if you have a student who's hypersensitive to, let's say, visual stimuli and auditory stimuli, do you have an area of your classroom dedicated for them to calm down? Perhaps an area where there's less sensory input. Some teachers, if they don't really have a lot of space in their classroom, they'll use tents so that it can be like a little calming corner. And actually, anyone could use it if they need it, right? And so giving that opportunity, that agency to those who know their sensory profile to have them have a place to calm down. And then maybe even the opposite for those who are seeking. I talked a little bit about having a tape around an area that can be for the sensory seeking individuals on whatever they need. So that's kind of the first thing I would do is like, do you have a place in your classroom to address this? And are you thinking about the sensory stimuli when you're designing your classroom? Are you thinking about the windows? Are they facing a busy street or something like that that can be extremely distracting? So just having them even sit in their classroom and say, hey, if I had visual stimuli, if I'm just looking at the visual stimuli in my classroom and I'm hypersensitive, what would catch my eye here? If I was auditory, think about all the different senses. Um, so that would be my first kind of planting the seed. Do you have a place in your classroom? And when you're sitting in your classroom and thinking about all the senses, what do you gather?
Great, thank you. Yeah, I know for myself, I had this huge mind shift, right? That shifting your mindset, right? And it took doing exactly what you're describing there of going, oh, wait, maybe that person is interpreting what's around them differently than me, which sounds like such a like duh kind of thing, right? But
Yes.
but it really does come down to thinking about what are all the different ways someone might be interpreting all of this. You were talking about data early, right? How
Yes.
they're interpreting all of these sensory data. Um, and so, kind of to that end, right, if we think about the leaves that you were talking about, right? So, how then can you help a neurodiverse child, relate one leaf to another? So, how can you help them categorize all these things,
Mm,
right? Because, there's like billions of different kinds of leaves, for example, and that's true of lots of things. So, how can you help?
yes.
You can't possibly introduce them to every single leaf, right, in the world.
Yes. So there's been studies done about this, and so just going with the leaf example, for example, let's use that. So if you show enough leaves, they can, when you have a very hypersensitive brain, a very detail-oriented brain, eventually you can kind of form a mental map. And usually where you land is kind of, like I said, you could maybe identify some patterns that a neurotypical person might not see as part of a leaf, but eventually you'll reach a kind of a mental, I even call it mental prototype of what a leaf is, so that when a future leaf that is new is introduced, they can appropriately label it. But that takes enough variations. Now, every child who has this profile, it can take sometimes 5 leaves, maybe 20 leaves, maybe 30 leaves. Um, but eventually, there is a point in which that mental prototype can be made. The science has shown that it's there. It's just about the variations that need to be shown to create that mental prototype. And so that's kind of how we can help, making sure that when we show one example of something, that's not necessarily a good sample pool. We might need to show many. So one of the things I also talk about is Temple Grandin. She wrote a book about this, and her mother realized this very quickly. And she realized that when she explained to Temple that that was for example, a church steeple, Temple didn't understand that the other church steeples in her town were also church steeple because she was using a very narrow category based on that one steeple that she saw. So her mom actually would drive to around her city, her town, I guess, and say that's also a church steeple and that's a church steeple. And then they would drive to another town and they would do the same thing until at some point with enough steeples, Temple was like, I understand what a church steeple is now. I understand. I've got enough data and I've built a mental prototype. And so now I know what a church steeple is. And so that's kind of the idea. And if you think about it, it's really kind of cool because there's probably things about a church steeple that Temple has noticed that goes with the definition of a church steeple that a neurotypical person can't even appreciate. And so you can think about occupations that are really good at that, like even like a paleontologist, right? Like being able to say, hey, that one little bone right there, like that means it's this type of dinosaur, versus this kind of dinosaur. So it's that kind of brain that is actually incredibly useful and that we shouldn't be trying to fix it.
Yeah, that's so I'm that's really what I'm hearing, I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that neurotypical individuals sometimes don't need multiple exposures to different items in the same category to create the category. And that perhaps individuals who are neurodivergent need those multiple exposures of all the steeples, say, to then create, oh, that's what a steeple, general steeple is, to create the category. So to get someone from bottom with bottom up processing, they need more exposure than someone maybe perhaps with top down. Am I understanding that
Yes,
correctly? Okay.
correct. Yes.
Okay.
And you can imagine the mistakes that can be made on either side. So someone who's a top down might actually inappropriately put something in a category that doesn't belong in a category because they have such a broad filter, broad idea. Whereas somebody who's doing bottom up may not have things in their category that should be in there, right? Because they haven't been exposed yet to that item to put it in that category. So you can see how there's still mistakes that can be made on either side. And that's just part of kind of just learning and building. Um, so you can get an idea that how these both of these brains work and how even there's strengths in both, right? Being a generalist is really good to get the big idea of something really quick.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really helpful and really fascinating, I think, at least to me, and hopefully to our participants too, is this idea that, oh, they need to come at it from a different angle, if you will, almost this whole top down,
Yes,
bottom up thing. Um, so my another question that came in was that, in a group or classroom setting, how can you help lighten the load for those in the group who are hypo and those who are hypersensitive in perhaps the same sense area, like visually? How do both people get what they need to thrive in the same space when what they need might be opposite from each other? Um, does,
absolutely. And
how
that
does one
is
handle that?
yeah, and that is such a challenge, right? Because we have limited amount of resources and time to help. And if there's such a diverse sensory profile, how do we, especially if they are actually at odds with each other, right? How do we do this? Um, and one solution I kind of hinted at is kind of reserving a space for both types of sensory profiles in your classroom if you can, or even time for those individual different profiles. So, for example, for someone who's hypersensitive, providing a more calm down, maybe a tent or something like that, where you can reduce the sensory stimuli. And then for those who are seeking, perhaps giving them time, maybe if they're tactile sensory seeking, if there's recess, giving them the appropriate items that they can sensory seek with, or even a place in the classroom that is not maybe if they're auditory, for example, if they're more of auditory seeking, sensory seeking, you might want to put them in a different place or give them an opportunity during recess to, bang on a drum or something like that. There's creative ways to do it. I understand the challenges as well because, you can have such a diverse classroom, and there's only a limited amount of help that you can get, right? But I do say just start with that, like having a place in the classroom that's reserved for both types of sensory profiles. Utilize creatively, like times like recess, to kind of give sensory seeking individuals the things that they need. Because that's such a great time where everyone's just kind of doing their own thing and during recess, at least I think so, where you can give that opportunity to that student.
Okay. So these next ones that came in are kind of go together. And so one is about an individual who says, we have an autistic preschooler at our church who often elopes from her mom and will walk up and down the aisles. I can see people squirming or feeling uncomfortable. As an early childhood special ed professional, it doesn't phase me, but I find myself wondering if I should say or do something, and if so, what? And there was another one kind of that was talking about how can you help parents understand and support their children's need for stimming. I think that many parents sometimes feel embarrassed maybe about the stimming because they may feel that it makes the people around them uncomfortable or maybe causes people to label their kids negatively. So, how can you, as professionals, help parents also who are kind of stuck in that spot? Um, Support their child's need for stimming, but also this idea of culture's perception of what that might mean.
Yeah, and that's I get that question a lot, and have been in clinics where that is a question that parents typically have. And I think it always starts with you as the parent, the culture that you set. So for example, let's say you're at a restaurant and you're with friends and your child's there and they start to stem, you could normalize it by stemming with them. You can even provide a timeout if they need to, where you honor that stemming, but put it, take them to a place where they can have the privacy to stem if they need to. For the church example, like you can even give that child something that they could do while they're walking up and down the aisle. or you can join them or outside. Say, hey, let's do this outside if you want. Um, there are all kinds of creative ways. I do understand that there's a lot of perception to that. And I think as the person, the parent, it's up to you to create that culture, create that mindset around you. And you'll be surprised of how many people will kind of be like, oh, this is okay. Like when you make it okay, they will kind of understand too that it's okay. Um, and as long as the stemming is not hurting others, you should definitely give that grace to the child to allow them to stem to self-regulate. Um, Always the last option if it is kind of, distracting. Because there's always we also have to honor other people's sensory profiles as well. You can always just walk out and allow that child to stem, whatever a room that you dedicate, or you go outside and you guys can stem together even, so that the child doesn't feel like they're being casted out, right? So there's a way that you can support them in that way to normalize it in a way. And I always say, like, you set the culture. You set the culture, and that child will know, right? If you are the one embarrassed, they're going to sense that. So just it starts with you. And so yeah, that's all I can say about that.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And so I heard you say, you want to allow the child to continue, but maybe go to a different space to honor other people's sensory profile, et cetera. But what would you do, say, if you have a team member or a colleague that you see that is, perhaps always trying to stop the child from stimming, rather than give them the space and the place to do so? What suggestions do you have for a professional to professional interaction around that?
Right. And that's a really difficult conversation. You probably want to have that conversation privately. Sometimes when I'm talking to someone who doesn't quite get it, I kind of just say, I'm sure there's things that you do that help calm you. Maybe you tap your pencil, maybe you bite your nails, maybe you do something of kind of just try to get them to see your point of view. And when I start with that, people start to get it. I'm like, so imagine if, tapping the pencil and all that is not enough. You have a very different neurological wiring and you require something different. And that's, and imagine like the environment around you is very stimulating, and you need something more than tapping your pencil or whatever you do to kind of cope. And so kind of just try to not demonize that person, approach them with curiosity to see where their understanding is coming from and try to bridge that understanding. I try to be patient with people because sometimes they don't know. Somebody might not know and they might not understand. And that's what's great about these seminars is like I feel like that's the role sometimes I want to have is let me help bridge that understanding so that we're all on the same page. I give the people the benefit of doubt that if I give them all the information, they can understand, and so that's how I would approach it, going through this kind of doing something that, talking about something that they can relate to. Do not demonize them, and then kind of bridge that understanding. Maybe ask them some questions about why they feel this way. And then if you need to, bring some science into it. Um, and that's how kind of I would approach it. I would do it privately. Do not, again, don't demonize this person. Always have the benefit of doubt that they're just coming at it from a place of ignorance. And then you're just there to help bridge that understanding.
Great, thank you. There was another question. This individual said, "This has all been very informative. However, I work with college populations. Do you have any information, suggestions, resources for how young neurodivergent adults transition to the college learning environment? I support all the public community colleges and university professionals who work with mental health in Illinois. The most frequent questions I get are how to support neurodivergent students in the classroom in college."
Oh, I love this because this is kind of, I'm also a professor at a university and I try to take into account of all the neurodivergent students in my class. And so, what I kind of say to students, if I was a person guiding neurodivergent students, I would say you need to know what you need. And so it's really accepting and advocating for yourself. If you need more time on the exam, go to, and I don't know what your equivalent of that here at your university is, but there's probably some sort of disability and accommodation department that you can go to get kind of time on the exam. Always speak up. And I tell that to my students in the very beginning. I'm like, if you have accommodations that you need, if you're neurodivergent, you need to come talk to me so that we can have a conversation and I can serve you and help you thrive and succeed in this class. And so neurodivergent students, I feel like sometimes we struggle, and we all struggle with this at that age, right? Of advocating for ourselves. And so um, for neurodivergent students, they've got that burden now to advocate for themselves in this environment. And so, but it's okay, though. These are the tools that they'll need for the rest of their lives. And so if I was guiding neurodivergent students, that's kind of what I would say. You got to know yourself, know what you need, and advocate for yourself. You've got to talk to the people around you to advocate for yourself. If I was talking to professors, I would say be very, very aware that there are different learning styles, different sensory needs of all the students in your classroom. And you need to be extremely sensitive to that and provide the accommodations appropriate. And it's really not that hard, as a professor, I will say it's really not that hard to accommodate. If it's an exam, more time, perfect, we can provide that. And there's usually resources on the campus to provide that too. And I try to, in my lessons and my lectures, provide different kind of sensory information. So I'm going to give the information auditory, visual, I'll have some tactile. And so I try to hit up kind of all the senses if I can. It's not always perfect, but I try. And so it's really we live in a new age where we're understanding all this, and I think it's really exciting, and it's really like fine-tuning all of education. And I always say to people too, it's like we live in a world now that there's so much sensory stimuli, more so than any other period of time. So it's no wonder that there's a lot of challenges of juggling all this, and that individuals who have sensory processing differences are finding a lot of challenges existing in this extremely high stimuli world. And so our job is to, again, lighten that load. Even when we're in college, we're learning, we have to, that's our role for me, as a professor.
Yeah, so kind of along that same vein, then, when we're talking about higher ed and now we're talking about kind of pre-service professionals, right? Do you think that we are training future teachers, medical professionals, therapists? Are we training them differently to engage with neurodivergent individuals? If not, what kind of changes do you see need to take place so that, you know, pre-service folk enter the field kind of prepared with this mindset, right? And if you've seen it done well, kind of what has been your experience in some of those examples of a situation where that's made a difference?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't speak for the training of educators. I can only speak to the training of the medical professionals. And I will say that that's something that's not talked about. And I actually did do some training for the fellows, the psychiatrist child fellowship program here in Austin. And I trained the psychiatrists that were going to become psychiatrists, future child psychiatrists, about all of this stuff. And it was just mind-boggling. I mean, I come from that field too, so I understand what's missing. And it's just crazy to me that we still live in an age with all this information available that these individuals who are highly trained did not know a lot of this stuff. And so I can't, I mean, I think we're moving the needle a little bit. Is it missing a lot? Yes, I still think so, based on just that limited experience where I'm training these future child psychiatrists and they're missing a big chunk of this information. And they actually found it so refreshing, and they had no idea why this was not, not integral part of their curriculum. And I imagine if that's the case for this program, it's got to be the case for a lot of programs out there. And so that's the only place I can really speak from experience. I'm sure somebody in the group can speak about the education and other fields. Um, but I imagine if I had to guess, maybe not. We're not there yet, but we're moving the needle slightly. I know other countries are way ahead of us, like the UK and Australia. They are way ahead of us on all of this, which is very surprising to me.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you. This has been really enlightening and informative. So if you have other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, you can also contact Dr. Austin. I'm putting that contact information there, and it'll be on the slide in just a moment. Um, but at this point, um, we just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Austin, for being here and sharing with us. We really appreciate that. And oh, that's interesting. There's a comment in there. If you're looking at the chat, Dr. Austin, you can see there's a couple of comments about what their experience are in terms of the current field, in terms of the new service professionals and what they're getting. And it looks like not a whole lot at the moment, so that we need to keep moving. Like you said, we need to keep moving that needle. Um,
I love, yeah, thank you so much for all the comments on that. I'm seeing that now. And yeah, I feel like, it starts with us creating the grassroots efforts to integrate this. But yeah, thank you so much, guys.
yeah, good. So at this point, we are going to kind of talk about a couple other things as we wrap up and do some housekeeping, and I'll talk about how to get a certificate. Um, but at this moment, I want to talk about our next event in this Uniquely Wired series, which will take place on July 9th. This webinar will focus on effective strategies for enhancing attention, motivation, and engagement in neurodiverse or struggling learners across elementary, middle, and high school. Please check the webinar event page for information on CE credits for this July 9th webinar. And the link I just put in the chat is to this one that you see on the screen for the one on July 9th. So if you want to learn more about it or register to attend, you can do so at that link. Today's webinar offers several different types of CE credits and a certificate of attendance for general use. To receive either of these items, all participants will need to complete a two-step process that includes an evaluation and a follow-up survey of some kind, depending on the type of CE that you require. So first, you'll complete an evaluation, which I'll give you the link to in just a moment. After that, you'll see a message that'll come up, and you would choose the type of continuing education credit that you would need, and you would click a second link, and that'll take you to the step 2. After you complete that, a certificate would automatically be emailed to you within 24 to 48 hours. Some email providers are notorious for sending these certificates to spam or junk folders, so please check those folders if you do not receive it. If you can't find it in any of those folders, just send us an email. There's an email on the screen there, ce@oneup.org, and I'll put that in the chat in just a minute. So for those who are watching this live, you're going to see a link to the evaluation and post-test in the chat. You might need to copy and paste that link into your browser to get it to work for you. It depends on your system whether it'll just pop open or not. So there is the link for the evaluation. For those of you who are watching this on demand or who might need to come back later to complete this part of the CE process, there will be a link to the evaluation on the webinar event page. There's going to be a purple button, just like what you see on the screen, that says continuing education, and you would just click that and it'll take you to the evaluation that you need to get the certificates. If you get an error message with any of these links, please read that error message. A lot of times an individual's firewalls or whatnot might block that, and then you got to talk to your IT folk. If you still get that error message, take a screenshot of it and send it to us at ce@oneop.org so that we can better assist you. And I will put that email address in the chat right now. All right. Be sure to visit us at our website, oneop.org, to explore upcoming events, articles, resources, and more. You can also find us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. We'll stick around for just a few more minutes for those who may need to grab links from the chat or other information. And we want to thank you all for being here, and thank you very much, Dr. Austin, for working with us these two sessions. They were really, really informative, and we learned a whole lot, and we're very grateful. We hope that everyone has a wonderful rest of your day and that we will see you at future events.